Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a tricolor camouflage with spray primer and paints. There are several artwork examples of Jade Falcon gamma patterns, but I'll be using the scheme on this Hellbringer from the Battle of Tukayyid book as my inspiration. I'm intentionally not using an airbrush, but if you have one, it will be great for this. I'll be using a lot of different paints and materials for this process, and there will be steps along the way that you may decide to skip or modify to suit your own preferences or available materials. Here's what I used to paint this model. For spray cans, I'll be using Rust-Oleum 2X Flat Red Primer and their clear gloss enamel, as well as a can of Valspar Satin Apple, which I don't recommend and we'll talk about later. I'm going to use Silly Putty as a masking material. The brand or cost shouldn't matter, so get the cheapest stuff you can find for this. For acrylic and oil paints, I'll be using Vallejo Game Color Extra Opaque Heavy Green, Model Color Khaki, Gunmetal Gray, Blue Green, and Earth, Pro Acryl Jade and Pyrrole Red, Citadel Contrast Militarum Green, Army Painter Dark Tone, and Blue Tone washes. For oil paints, I'll be using MIG Oil Brusher Mecha Light Green, Weed Green, Earth, and Yellow Bone. I used several brushes, including Monument Hobbies Kolinsky No. 1 and 0, as well as their synthetic No. 0 and No. 2 for washes. Finally, a small dry brush, soft eye makeup brush dedicated for acrylics, and one for oils. A round wooden toothpick or small, non-sharp implement is useful for pressing masking putty, and some odorless mineral spirits and synthetic or natural cotton swabs will be useful for cleaning up the oil paints if you choose to use them. For model preparation, I've already given an even layer of flat red primer by applying a couple coats and letting the paint dry per the instructions. I've got my ball of Silly Putty and a toothpick ready so that I can begin to mask off the areas I want to leave brown. Making some rolled up putty snakes, I'll begin wrapping areas of the model with short sections and create some rings or spirals. Once placed, I'll gently but firmly press the edges down a bit to sharpen the shape of the exposed areas for my pattern. I like to use a good pair of scissors to trim any extra bits hanging off after I'm happy with the placement. If you try to pull the excess away, it lifts from the miniature and stretches out. It kind of defeats the purpose. If it's very warm when you're doing this, the Silly Putty will have a tendency to start to sag and droop. Please keep that in mind if your putty masked models are going to be sitting around in a warm environment for very long. I also like to roll and pull a long section of putty and then cut them to length for manageability when placing. Shorter strips are easier to work with, and you can always connect more and overlap other pieces if you need more. Remember, this step is what defines the width of the colors on your camo pattern, so if you want to have wider color bands, then adjust the size of the putty accordingly. While I was making this video, I had the thought of taking more putty and going in a perpendicular, overlapping pattern either before or after the first masked paint layer was applied to get a camo grid or diamond-like pattern depending on the orientation, and that might be interesting to try out. With the masking placed, I've shaken my can for a minute or two to start to spray in what I thought were light coats. I'm trying to do short, light passes as I apply to avoid having seams show between the colors when the masking is removed. Either this paint has a heavy flow nozzle or I had a heavy finger, and combined with me probably not making fast enough passes, I ended up having too much applied as I was working. The paint seems to have a thicker consistency than the Rust-Oleum primer, and it started to hide sharp details on the plastic. If I were to do this scheme again, I'd use a different green altogether, probably a color from Rust-Oleum or Krylon. I suggest not using Valspar paint on anything smaller than terrain pieces, as it seems too thick to reliably use on detailed miniatures. Regardless of the paint issues or brand being used, multiple thin coats are the way to get a good, even coverage over the base red-brown. Be sure to follow the instructions on the paint that you're using and waiting for coats to dry to be patient with your progress to avoid getting drips and detail loss. I made sure to let my paint dry for several hours as I knew I'd be handling it by removing the masking putty as well as the follow-up paint steps. With the paint cured, removing the Silly Putty is a relatively simple process. I just take my toothpick and gently work the putty away from the model, grabbing the strips with my fingers when I have enough to get a hold of. The enamel is stronger than the acrylic tends to be, but you should still take care not to be too aggressive with whatever implement you're using to lift off the putty so you don't scratch or remove the paint. Quickly pulling the Silly Putty away will tend to cause it to tear, which may end up help clearing it out of the way so you can easily get to the next strip. Paint doesn't want to stick to the Silly Putty, so the paint can flake off, and you may want to have an area prepared for the mess it can make. As you remove the masking, you'll see the pattern begin to emerge. I know it seems obvious, but double check over the entire miniature for any residual putty you may have missed. Sometimes it can blend in and be overlooked. With the masking removed, the model has a great looking pattern that would have taken a lot longer to do with traditional brush painting. Now it's time to add the third base color to the camo pattern. A darker green like this Vallejo heavy green will set nicely between the light green and brown tones while helping to mimic the reference artwork. Using a number 0 or a number 1 detail brush, begin to place the paint on areas throughout the model. This is the first detail step during this process, so it's going to take a bit more time to make sure the crevices and gaps are getting some of that dark green paint. It may also take a second coat to ensure a nice uniform coverage, so don't worry if you get done with your green accents and it needs to be touched up again. The stronger coverage is one of the main reasons I use this extra opaque color, but it really was the green I was looking for as well. You'll see as I progress with the brushwork, I'm mainly putting paint over the light green pattern areas to even out the colors on the model, as I seem to have a bit wider green stripes than the brown. Tailor this step to your individual results from the earlier steps and personal preference on the color coverage you're trying to achieve. I'm generally following the angled slope of the two base colors, but if you see that in many areas it's more of a spot or short stripe than a full flowing line like the brown and the light green. If you wanted, you could even counter the angles of predominant areas and go in directional stripes and splotches to really break up the color pattern more. Off the top of my head, I think a series of narrower dark green or black lines in opposite angles would look really interesting. If you're using alternative colors, try to save the darkest color for this step, as you can see you're really going to want that coverage to be as simple and easy as possible. Don't be afraid to stipple and intentionally create uneven or jagged edges while you work. Smooth flowing lines aren't needed, and if you've watched the Easy Gray Death Legion video, the dark green is being applied in the same style as the dark gray on the Marauder. When you're happy with the amount of green accents, do a final once over to make sure you didn't miss any glaringly obvious areas before moving on. As soon as the green is dry, you can start with the shading wash. I'll be using Citadel Contrast Militarum Green, but if you want to use something different like a dark green wash, as for example this green tone quick shade wash from Army Painter, that's a great alternative. Whichever one you use, get a larger brush to apply the wash and make sure you shake up the bottle really well before starting. I've used this contrast green multiple times, and if you've seen any of the contrast tutorials I've done, then you're familiar with my method of a top-down working paint into the recesses as you let gravity help draw the paint towards the lower areas of the model. This step is designed to darken the recesses while also tinting the red, brown, and light green into a more drab and dingy tone. Straight out of the pot, the green is going to merge well over the light green and the red-brown and will take on some of the nice earthy mud tones as the red is subdued. As with any wash or contrast paint, make sure to check the model for flat and large areas where pooling and coffee staining rings can occur. A bit of light brushing and wicking away will make short work of them if you check frequently instead of waiting until the paint is partially dried. The balance with contrast paint is having enough on the model to work like it should by pulling into the recesses, but not too much that you get pooled gooey paint, or so little that it doesn't have enough on the surfaces to work that magic. Again, a traditional dark green wash of your choice will work in a very similar fashion and net the same desired shading and tinting. No, I didn't forget the PPC barrels, I just knew I was going to do something different with them and didn't need to waste the time applying and wicking away the paint. You can see I did plenty of touching the brush to areas to move or wick excess away as the model is completely covered. If you find that area has started to dry, just use more of the contrast paint in the same area to activate the medium, and then after using some soft brushing motions to remove the stain, wick away the majority of the excess and let it dry. This doesn't need to be showroom perfect though, it's camouflage and we've got a lot more work to do on it, and that will make up for a few uneven areas. I always let my contrast paints dry for at least an hour, and since the next step involves dry brushing, you'll want to make sure you don't have any areas hiding wet or damp wash. There's some nice definition going on after that contrast wash, and the green and browns are much more in line with the forest camo like the example art. I'm going to take some Vallejo khaki or another sandy tan color and use an eye makeup brush to start a layer of dry brushing. You don't need much paint for this, and I only put a small amount on my palette paper. Once you have a bit of paint on the brush, aggressively swipe and swirl the brush on your paper towel in many directions to remove most of the paint. You shouldn't see any streaking when you apply it on the model. If you do, go back and brush the paper towel more. Using light but deliberate strokes, begin to apply the khaki. Perpendicular to sharp and raised edges is what you're trying to go for, as well as a downward motion in the areas to lighten the higher areas and not the lower shaded ones. There will of course be areas you just need to get the brush into, and that's fine. Just work gradually instead of trying to get one area done at once. This will allow the pigment to adhere and then dry before you come back again, and it may look more like what you want without having to keep applying more paint. The changes will be subtle for the most part, so don't worry if you don't see a drastic shift at first. You can always come back to the top side of an exposed area with another round of dry brushing to make them pop, so try to give the model a good once over before focusing too much effort in a small spot. During the process, I only reloaded my brush once more after the first, so you can see there isn't a need for very much paint. Tops of torsos, weapons, shoulders, and arms are all good areas to give a second pass to. I also like to get on top of the armor on the knees and the forward exposed upper leg if it makes sense. If you need a smaller brush to get into some tighter areas, go ahead and do so with what you have available. You don't have to do this entire step with just one brush. With the dry brushing complete, the next step is to add the jade or blue trim accent details. Depending on the cluster you're painting, grab an appropriate color. Ironically, I'm using Pro Acryl Jade for my trim work, and by the end of the tutorial, it's going to look blue. I could lie and say that this was intentional, but in reality I wanted a jade green result like the artwork, and got a bit carried away with some of the oil blends later on in the process that left them looking blue. You'll see that later, but for this step, get your final detail brush and add a touch of water or flow improver to your paint if needed, and start to find the accent areas. I'm going straight off the reference piece since this mech is the same as the artwork. Of course, that's only helpful in this one case, but there are several things you can do to make this kind of trim accenting a bit easier. Pick areas that have natural trim edges. The U-shaped panel on the front of the center torso is a good example in this case. Or use entire small panels that are raised and easily accessed, like the raised armor ring detail above the arm pods. That way you're not working against interfering areas of the model, and you can get a nice application angle with your brush strokes. If you're trying for a brighter looking green, I'd probably recommend something similar to Pro Acryl's green or P3's Iosin green to avoid the potential for a blue or blue-green result. The next step is to add some metallic accents in a few areas. I like using a darker silver like gunmetal because I'll be putting a wash over it later to really get a more subdued and functional appearance out of the bare metal effect. With my detail brush, I'm picking out interesting areas like small vents and exposed moving joint tracts to add the color to. You can get as involved with this as you want, and if it's an area that's hard to see or hard to get to, it's okay to skip over trying to carefully maneuver a tiny bit of paint between the other areas you painted, as it likely won't be seen anyway. Don't get too worried about trying to make every little unique area have something different than the camo. We've already made our accents, so these pops of metal are just going to take a little bit further into the example artwork. The major areas that will show up most in this case are knee joints, tops of shoulder sockets, PPC barrels, and the front of the missile launcher. Aside from a few spots in the knee, all of those areas are easy to reach and make for some nice accenting additions to the otherwise muted green tones of the camo. And while on this model I know I'm using gunmetal, I've also used colors like copper and tin as metallic accents, and when combined with a dark wash or even a black, you get a unique and grimy looking metal appearance that can combo well with other paint job colors like lighter tones, or maybe adding some much needed color pops to a white or a gray paint job. After you have all your metallic applied, it'll be ready to blackwash. I'll be using Army Painter Dark Tone right out of the bottle and a smaller brush to allow me to target the areas with the gunmetal. I like the Army Painter wash for this type of work because it's not as thin as something like Nuln Oil, and I can really direct the application out to the joining areas and the outer edges with my brush. Either product is a good wash for this though. I'm pretty liberal with the application as I want the recesses and crevices to really have a nice amount of black shading and to have the flat surfaces darkened at the same time. I'm still controlling the pooling and moving any heavy buildups as I would with any other wash, but this step is mostly about letting the wash do the work for you and accepting the unique result without stressing over the application too much. If you're unsure of the wash and how it may look on your model, consider applying it to one small area and letting it dry to see if you want to continue. If you don't, just touch up the metallic in that small area and try something different. If you find you've got a bit of too dark after drying, instead of redoing all the metallic, consider going back and just adding small touches or even a bit of dry brushing onto the gunmetal areas, focusing on the tops and the highest points. You'll get a bit of a simulated reflection for your effort, and it's less work than starting back with the base metallic color. Let that wash dry before moving on. Because I intend to use oils to dry brush on the green, I want to put some edge highlights on the accent jade color. I'll be doing this with just some simple dry brushing using a smaller flat brush and some Vallejo blue-green. If you prefer, you can certainly do a traditional edge highlight since there's not a lot of the areas and it wouldn't be very time consuming to do so. I'm just wanting to get the initial rough highlights as I know I'll be using those oils afterward, and this is how I save some time by bringing up the edges before that step. Using a paper towel, I'm deloading the brush and using light controlled strokes to try to get as much of the edges without a buildup on any of the green or metallic. This isn't a perfect precision method, so a bit of highlight color will likely end up on the areas that are around the jade color. But again, I know I've got follow-up steps to cover and I can mask those. Fortunately, working in a mostly green palette will really work to my benefit with that as opposed to some sort of vibrant contrasting color, so keep that in mind if you're doing something different like this but with different colors. I'll go over the areas 2 or maybe 3 times in order as I go over every area sequentially. This lets each area dry and show its true appearance before I try to dry brush more paint in an area that may or may not need it. Again, if you're so inclined, you can just do simple edge highlights with the detail brush and will likely get a bolder and more defined result. Before I move on to oils, I know there's some of you thinking that that's not something you're wanting to get involved with, so I went ahead and made a matte coat varnish on the Mini for the photograph to show you that it's been accomplished. You're welcome to skip past the oils portion of the tutorial and move on to the details section so that after they're done you'll know what the camo and accents will look like minus the finish work. If you plan to work with oils, then there's no need to matte varnish at this point. There was a couple areas in the need of cleanup on the Mini that I missed, and you can partly see in the vent on the front of the hip joint where some contrast paint didn't shade the red-brown enough. I touched this up after noticing before I applied the oils. For those of you interested in seeing how you can use some artist oils to really up your camouflage game, this is the part you'll want to see. If it's not your thing, feel free to skip ahead, but just like the intro to oils I did on the Pride Timberwolf, this is a step up from that as I start to use multiple colors on the model. I've got my odorless mineral spirits, or white spirits, a jar with a lid, and a couple swabs. I'll be using a small eye makeup brush and a flat synthetic brush to apply my oils. Here's the MIG oil brusher colors I'll be using, and if you don't use these, then regular artist oils will also work, and you'll likely need to thin them with a bit of OMS. I'll be using the smaller eye makeup brush to gently blend the color, and you can see that I've already dispersed the blue-green a bit, and that's what I've done with my brown tone. I don't want too much on the brush as I feel out how the color applies, so I stipple and then run the brush over the paper towel to make sure I'm not saturating the panels. Then I find the brown areas I want to add my oils to and start applying the color. I'm keeping my brush angled widthwise in line with the stripes so I can keep the majority of the paint directed at those camo brown areas. You'll see me reload the brush with just a small amount of paint and then tap the towel to make sure it's not too wet, because this process is something you want to feel out as you go. You won't get it done in one pass, and that's the point. You want to have to work the paint around a little bit after you've established it in areas you want, so that you can catch the surfaces with the oils to highlight the color and bring up those fuzzy camo blends that would otherwise necessitate the use of an airbrush. A stipple motion from time to time, along with some gentle swipes, helps blur the edges between the greens on the model, and you can see the changes manifest gradually as you target areas you want to have the highlighted blends. Make sure you find the easy to see areas that will show the most when you're looking at the model. Those are usually the easiest to access. Now, without worrying too much about cleaning off my paint from my brush, I'm just going to get rid of the last brown pigment before moving on to the brighter green. You'll see it on the paper towel if there's brown, so if that's the case, remove more of the paint before going into the green areas and blending the oils over the green. The brown that's already present will still be able to be blended, so your green should merge well when it approaches a transition and make a really nice blend between both colors. When it's time to make the brightest highlight, take a small amount of the yellow bone and then deload the brush with the remaining green and gently brush over the highest areas in the same way you'd dry brush the tops of the surfaces. If you get a bit too much, you can grab a cotton swab that's been dampened by odorless mineral spirits and use it to smooth or remove some of the paint. Keep in mind that it will activate all the oils it touches, so don't try to do too much. I'm going over all the lightest green areas to really give them a muted flat green color, while the darker green and brown areas remain mostly untouched in this step. You'll see me touching the model a bit. I do try not to do that with oils, but sometimes I forget, and this wire and the cork makes the model spring back and forth too much. Bring up the highlights as much as you want, and then it will be time to finish with a quick highlight of the jade. I'm using my small synthetic flat brush and really trying to keep the blue off of the areas around the accents. It will get on some adjacent panels, and I'll show you how to touch those up after this step is completed. This is also the color that I wish I hadn't used, because it made my jade color too much into the blue hue, and now I have a blue accent instead of a jade green, but that's okay because this mistake still worked out in the end. I would have used a more yellow green or bright green if I were to do it over again. Use the swab to clean up any major areas that got some of the oil on them, and work until you've got the nice blends on each side of the accent panels. You can add a bit of white or bone, just like to the green, if your color needs a bit more pop in some areas. With the application done, a bit of cleanup will be needed, and to do that, those swabs or even makeup wedges can be used with a bit of OMS in a jar. The lid helps keep the fumes down between use. You don't want the swab or sponge soaked, you just want it damp enough to remove the oils, so don't saturate it and then go directly to the model. Rolling it out on a paper towel will get it to where you want it, so then you can have something to just reactivate the oils a little bit on the surface that you want to correct. I'm attacking the metallic areas first that have some light green, and you can see it's fairly straightforward. These swabs are synthetic and not natural cotton. Keep that in mind, as a natural fiber of cotton will get stringy and end up leaving fuzz everywhere. Just gently massage the paint mistakes with the swab, and it should end up on the swab and not the mini. Rotate it to use different areas so you're not smudging paint, and replace the swabs frequently, or if you're switching colors that you're removing, switch the swabs out completely. After this step, I'll let the oils cure for at least 4 hours or more before I gloss coat varnish to seal it in. If you wish, you can wait for a couple days for the oils to cure completely and then paint over them as you would any other paint, but I prefer the quicker turn time and the added layer of protection all of my paintwork that I've done so far. Between cuts, I've gone in and added PVC barrel glows, laser lens jeweling, and some minor details. I'll show you a quick way to do a fast blue cockpit, and that's especially easy on something like this small 3-pane style cockpit here. I've got my blue-green again and my detail brush, and we'll just place the full-strength paint in all 3 glass areas. Turn the mini as needed to get a good angle, and try not to get it on the cockpit reinforcement beams. You're looking for smooth, even coverage, so if you need to wait and touch it up after the first coat a bit, go ahead and do that. I've got some Army Painter blue tone, and right out of the bottle, I'm going to hit these lower areas and push the wash towards the outer edge lines where the recesses meets the glass. Work the wash downward, and if you let too much get on the blue, wick it away with a paper towel. Let that first application dry, and then come back and hit the lowest areas again to get them a bit darker and reinforce those shadows. You don't need much paint. The last step is to take a bit of the wash and a bit of the paint and blend them together, and then that's going to create your midline merge that you just want to apply basically directly in the middle of the glass panel, and that will mix well with the wash that's already on the glass, and once it's dry, you'll be all set. Between that step and this one, I've gone and added decals from Fighting Piranha Graphics, as well as some other companies. I've also added heatsink glow effects to the back, and that tutorial will be linked at the end of the video. There's white numbers and light colored symbols that really need a bit of dirtying up to make them fit with the camo appearance. To do that, I like to use the Army Painter soft tone to just add a quick layer of griminess or brown tone to those white areas to take it down a touch. Vallejo earth makes a great dried mud and dust effect. I'm going to dry brush this on the lower legs and feet, being more aggressive with the pigment towards the lowest areas. You don't have to have the model off the base to do this, so if yours are still attached, it's still very easy to get this weathering done in the same way. As you start to apply paint to those areas above the feet, make sure your brush is deloaded on the paper towel so you don't end up with too much dirt too high up. You can use a finger or swab to wipe it away quickly if you notice any wet streaks that you don't like. To finish, I put it on a base with texture paste, added some flock, static grass tufts, and gave the entire model a matte varnish with my airbrush. The last step was some art coat gloss on the lenses and cockpit glass, and this is the finished miniature. I hope you found these techniques helpful. Here's Tex to take us out.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Heat critical, shutdown imminent. Time for Pop-Tarts.